So 5 years ago, almost exactly, well, give or take, I began dating this wonderful woman. As you can see, I fiddle with my wedding ring all the time, so it ended up all right for me. I was just smitten with her. Smitten is a word from the 1930s. You could find it in a dictionary, except dictionaries are things from the 1980s. No. Look it up on the Wikipedia, kids. I was just head over heels for her. I'd been in a really serious dating relationship years before that, about a decade ago, and just gotten royally burned. It ended awfully. And I came out of that relationship just thinking, I don't know that I ever want to enter into anything remotely close to that again. I was just broken. And then, 5 years later, I grew up a lot in that 5 years. I think God did some cool stuff in my heart and in my life in that time. And lo and behold, I really was open again. And I fell hard again. My wife was living in San Diego when we started dating. I was here in Atlanta. She was out in San Diego. Was that like a mini woo? I've been there. Huzzah. Okay, San Diego. For life. Word unto thy mother. That's cool, right? That's not cool? Okay. Anyway, she lived out in San Diego. I was here in Atlanta, and so we did sort of a monthly flight. Someone would fly one way or the other. I went out there a couple times. She came back here a couple times. We did the long-distance relationship for the first few months of our dating, and it was just amazing. The very first time that we really hung out as a dating couple, I knew her a little bit before that, was we actually both had friends in Nashville, and so we met up in Nashville. And I remember driving home to Atlanta and thinking, oh my gosh, like there was no drawbacks here. There's I didn't have any real issues. That doesn't mean she's the perfect human by any means. She's a flawed human being, believe me, right? Oh, look who's talking. She's a human being. That's all I mean. But I remember driving back and just thinking, my goodness, I'm not worried about anything. You know that drive, right? Whether it was long distance, whether you drove to Nashville, or whether you just went out on a date and drove home from the date, and you're like, man, that was great. Some things, right? Because that's all dates, isn't it? The statistical probability is that almost every date you ever go out on is not the one, right? Almost everyone you date, they're not the one, right? So there's always that, we might have to work through, we might have to talk about. And I just remember, for me at that time, there was nothing like that. I was just so in love with her from very early on. And there's that natural time, whether it's friendship or dating or whatever, right, where you're just getting to know one another. You're asking questions about one another. And if you're smart, you're asking hard questions about one another. Not just so where'd you grow up? Oh, that's great, right? If you're smart, you're asking a little deeper questions. Trying to find out, who is this person really? Not just what their favorite sports teams are, right? You want to know, and you want to be known. And Allie had gone through even more stuff than I had in past relationships, and she had good questions. She had good questions for me. She had good questions about me. Who was this man? What was his character? Is this worth pursuing? I loved her. I wanted to be known by her. When she asked questions, I promise you, my response was not, "How dare you?" Right? That would be nuts. I didn't get angry because she had questions about who I was. Right? I didn't get defensive because she wanted to find out more. Quite the opposite. I was eager. And that's how God is. That's how God is. And I want that to frame us a little bit, frame the way we look at this series in the next month. We believe that God wants to be known. God wants to be known. God, we think even in here, God has made himself known. And he's not offended by your doubts. Jesus is not afraid of skepticism. He's really not. Whether you have gotten to the point where you say, yeah, Jesus is an actual figure in history, regardless of whether you think he's God or not, if you've gotten there, or if you just say, it's Jesus is this concept maybe represented in this book. Either way, whether he's a concept, whether he's a person, whether he is God of gods, none of those are afraid of questions. None of those are afraid of skepticism, of doubts. People are, right? Sometimes we are. Sometimes those that claim to represent him get freaked out by questions, but he's not. He's not afraid of your questions. And thus, even though the church has sometimes been that way, even though the church has sometimes said, none of that, stop with the questions, how dare you? We're not afraid of questions, okay? This community in general, this is a safe place for questions, just as we sort of outlined before. This is a welcome place for doubts, for skepticism, for questions. He's not afraid. But I think we should start investigating a little bit, not just talking about our questions for him, because we all have them. Whether we have faith or not yet, we all have some questions for him. I think we should start with some questions for us first. And my first question would be this. And this is a good question, again, regardless of whether you believe or not. How can you know that there's a God? How can you know if there is a God? That's a really important question to think about. If there is a God, how could you know? What would be your standard for understanding that God? What would be your line of reasoning for saying that there is or there is not? That's really worth thinking about. That's really worth thinking about. The second question is like it. How do you know what you know? Or what you think you know? Certainly we all know things, but how? What's the process by which you come to the point of some amount of certainty? In anything. Let's even just say functional certainty. How do you come to functional certainty in your day-to-day to day where you've just got to live life? What's that look like for you? Our world right now, especially our culture, tends to come at this from a couple different angles. And I would say that both angles, at the end of the day, are kind of similar. Maybe both have the same root. So I would say this: how do you know what you know? If you were to go take a poll around Atlanta or around our country, maybe just our cultural world, probably a couple things would pop up again and again. How do you know what you know? Empiricism, right? That which is verifiable, provable. You can repeat the experiment and get the results over and over again. Empiricism or experience. And I just want to throw out some questions for us with that. I want to make us think a little bit deeper. Because any of us can recognize that both of these are ways that we can know things. Right? We can repeat an experiment and watch it happen. We can experience something. We can know to some extent. But are these good ways of really discovering any and all truth? Are there not some issues with either one? I would say there are. Empiricism is essentially modernism. Okay, the modern mind, the modern philosophical mind says, I only believe that which I myself can test and prove. I only believe those things that I can repeat and watch in a laboratory and see that they are true. I only believe the provable, right? And I would say, that's great. Not against that per se. And yet, especially if you're talking about that which you know functionally, that which you know day to day, to be able to get up and go to work and deal with human beings in the real world, we function all the time on things that are not necessarily empirically provable or not. Just a couple things that sort of occur to me. This is not infallible by any means, but things that I would say I know, and yet I don't know how you would prove them or not. For example, I know when I have an emotion. I know what I feel. Now, you might say my feelings are crazy and untrustworthy. Nonetheless, I know what I feel, and it'd be really hard to map that out in any kind of experiment, wouldn't it? You might be able to figure out, you might be able to say, well, we can observe this, and this, and then postulate that from that, et cetera. But at the end of the day, you know your emotional life in a different way than you know things empirically. And even then, you also can know, to some extent, especially if you know somebody really well, what's going on with them, right? How about even sticking with your internal life, your thoughts? I mean, you can empirically see synapses, perhaps, in a brain, but I can't empirically prove the logical process that was going on as I ordered Zaxby's the other day. I can't prove to you exactly what I was thinking other than just to say it. There are things we know that are not necessarily provable. Those are just a couple thoughts. And then if you think of the experiential, we know things because we have experienced them. It's probably even more common for us. Even more common for us. What is true for me? And this would be a good example of what you might call postmodernism or late modernism, right? If modernism looked at the world and said, the world is chaos, we can put it to order via provable experiments and understanding the world through empiricism, we can give order to the world. Postmodernism or late modernism goes even just a step further to make the self the ultimate arbiter of truth. And so then the self becomes the ultimate arbiter of truth, really regardless of the empirical world. At the end of the day, we say, you know what? You can run your experiments all you want. I just know or I just don't know because I have or I haven't experienced it. The postmodern or late modern mind tends to look at the world and see chaos and say, I'll find meaning within the chaos. I don't have to necessarily put order to it to find meaning. I'll just find meaning within the randomness. And this is a little bit of where my generation, your generation, our Gen X millennials tend to come a little more from this perspective. They're saying that the next philosophical wave is different than even those things, but that's almost still to come. Most of us kind of live in this world a little more, even those of us who say, well, no, this is truth. We tend to come at things and say, nah, my experience really is truth. And there are some serious problems with that. With experience as our guide to knowledge, to knowing, everything is context. I mean, context is always important, but experience as our guide to all truth makes context literally everything. So let me give you an example. Tim Keller says this, without God, without the idea of a God who dictates what is knowable, what is right, wrong, etc., there can be moral feelings, but there can never be moral obligations. So when experience is king, you can have moral feelings, but you cannot make moral demands on anyone outside of the self. Right? So you begin to have a really hard time. I mean, we would all say it. We'd all look at the Middle East right now and say, that's evil. It doesn't matter what religion you come from, doesn't matter what background you come from. We see what ISIS is doing in Iraq and Syria, and we say, that's deeply messed up. That is wrong. That is evil. But if experience is how you know anything, if experience is your ultimate teacher, all you can say is that feels wrong. You have nothing to base your demand that it end on. You have moral feelings, but not moral obligations. Because at the end of the day, my experience dictates what's true for me, but your experience, no matter how ugly it looks, that dictates what's right for you. So I can't tell you one way or the other. All right, so those are some problems with it. And I would say this, regardless of which direction you come from, and again, I think they're both essentially the same because they both are self as arbiter of truth, right? Empiricism says, I don't believe it until I watch it in an experiment. I don't believe it until I see it proven with my own eyes. Experience says, I don't believe it until I feel it. I don't believe it until I experience it myself. Essentially the same thing. And both of these begin to give meaning to everything. They begin to become your narrative. Your method becomes your narrative. Your method will become your narrative. A word that's used sometimes in talking about the narrative that gives meaning to everything in our lives is the meta-narrative. Sort of the overarching narrative. And your method will become your meta-narrative. So if you think of personal experience as your meta-narrative. Personal experience, the things that I've seen, the things that I've done, the things that I've experienced are the things that give meaning to life. That is how I know what is true, what is not, whether there is a God or not, what things are right, what things are wrong, etc. When that has become my meta-narrative, I lose a grasp on things that are objectively true. I begin to lose my grasp on things that are true regardless of context. Right? The fact that we all know in our soul that when we hear about beheadings in Iraq, when we hear that those kind of things are happening to children, we hear about things about child sexual exploitation, the commercial sexual exploitation of children. Doesn't your soul just begin to boil a little bit? Of course it does. Of course it does. Because that is something that's true regardless of how you feel about it, which is why you feel the way you do about it. But here's the thing, you'll lose it. You'll begin to lose your grip on those things. Here's an example. Recently, a massive interview was done among millennials in particular. And they asked the question, or they asked several questions about things that were absolutely true. How do you know that something is absolutely true regardless of the context? How do you know that something is true regardless of your experience? And maybe you don't fit into this category exactly, but this was a large number of 20-somethings, early 30-somethings that had no idea how to answer the question. Literally did not understand the question. They've grown up with such a worldview, such a paradigm of experience as my only lens for that which is right and wrong. They literally can't take that off and say, of course oppression is always wrong, regardless of my experience or not. They couldn't separate it. They couldn't answer the question. Your method becomes your narrative. If empiricism is your way of understanding truth, in general, what we see is naturalistic evolution as meta-narrative. This is not going to be an attack on evolution, by the way. Not interested in that conversation per se. I am interested in the conversation of evolution as meta-narrative for these purposes. This is everywhere. I don't mean that the word evolution is everywhere. I don't mean it in the way you may have heard it before. What I mean is evolution as the narrative that gives meaning to life. Evolution as the overarching story that helps us understand truth is all over the place. I don't know if you recognize it or not, but I mean, it's all over TV. It's all over the web, classrooms, certainly in public schools where I was educated. and in the media for sure. And just to give you an example of this, I read the New York Times a fair amount. Actually, they started making you pay after like 10 free articles or whatever, so I've been reading the Washington Post more often, but because I'm cheap, word. But I do read the New York Times a fair amount. They have some fascinating articles in there. I mean, even when I radically disagree with something, it doesn't matter. I love reading different perspectives. And this is all over the New York Times. And so I thought, man, I wonder if I just searched evolution, what I would find on the Times website, for example. So here are just a few of fairly recent stories. How caffeine evolved. Does evolution explain religious belief? Evolution and bad boyfriends. Evolution and inner conflict. Evolution and delayed adulthood. Evolution and lethal violence in chimps. Evolution and Bible literalists. Evolution and climate change. Evolution in tribalism biology and macroeconomics. Didn't see that one coming, did you? It's because for the Times, evolution is the metanarrative. When we're grasping for what is the story that gives meaning to these bits of facts, that is the story that we run to as a culture in general. And that's what happens when empiricism is the king of how we know what is knowable. I think it's interesting to at least point out, again, like I said, not a diatribe on the scientific theory of evolution. Whether you believe in this, hate it, whatever, there are many real deal Christians that believe in some form of evolution or another. So again, not an attack on that necessarily. But I think it's at least worth pointing out that there are issues with that as well. That there are hard questions that need to be asked for whatever your method of understanding truth is. There are hard questions that need to be asked for whatever meta-narrative you choose. There are some mathematicians, for example, recognize mathematicians and biologists are totally different fields, but some mathematicians that would say statistically almost impossible that humanity evolved in the amount of time that's given. There are philosophers that would say, hey, you actually, you can't pair naturalism and the evolutionary process. There are just too many statistical improbabilities that go with this. And those are questions that if you believe in evolution as a biological truth theory, et cetera, you need to think about those questions. And absolutely, if it is your narrative, if it is that story that gives meaning to life, you better think about those questions. You better give some really long, hard thought, not just blow it off. You know, one of the things that's brought up when statistical improbability is thrown into the mix is an idea called a multiverse. I don't know if you've heard of that before or not, but when the argument kind of goes down, somebody says, evolution, no. The guy who says no says, it's statistically improbable to the point that it's almost impossible. And this guy says, well, maybe there's a multiverse. Which essentially means maybe there are billions or even infinite numbers of universes where any number of variations could have happened, and we just happen to live in that one universe out of a zillion where the statistical improbability worked. the multiverse. I'll come to this a little more in a second, but if you get to the point of evolution's my narrative, and yet there are some real statistical issues with it. Maybe it doesn't disprove necessarily, but there's some issues. And your options are, okay, maybe there's a God. Maybe there's a God. Or maybe there are just a zillion universes out there, and this just happens to be the one where it happened this way. I would press you really hard to say, which one is making more assumptions? Which one is making more logical leaps? Which one looks more like empiricism, even? You might come to your own conclusion on that. For me, a cause and a causer is less of a leap than a zillion universes, and I just happen to be in the right one. So like I said, this is not an attempt to debate evolution, but I would say this. Science and Jesus are asking different questions. Science and God's, and I would even put science in quotation marks, because I do not believe that the two are at odds by any means. But they're asking different questions, asking radically different questions. From my perspective, science answers and asks questions of how, which is why it's not a very good metanarrative, which is why it's not a very good way to determine how you understand truth, how you would even begin to understand whether there is a God or not. It's a different question than what science answers, in my opinion. Jesus answers why. God asks and answers why questions when empiricism and science as my lens tends to ask how questions. And experience asks different questions than Jesus as well. It's not a very good way to determine truth at the end of the day. That point may have been made already. But experience really asks questions like, what works? What works? Right? I mean, what works for me? What's pragmatic? And Jesus is fundamentally answering a different question. Whether you believe it or not, he is addressing a different question, and that is what is. Experience addresses the question, what works? Jesus addresses the question, what is? What is? I would say this. I really believe this. I'll wrap up here in a sec. The temporal demands the eternal. The temporal, meaning anything that exists for a period of time, begins and ends, or at least begins, demands something or someone outside of it that has no beginning, has no end. And I would say this, no matter what your method, empiricism or experience, you push it to its logical conclusion, there's always an infinite. There's always an infinite. There's always the eternal at the end of the day. So, for example, the multiverse idea that I brought up. That's ultimately saying there is something. There is something outside of this that's eternal, even if it's just the context. The only question that's left is what is eternal, or who we believe is eternal. And then that begins to answer some of the other questions. This is a form of what's called the cosmological argument, the cosmological apologetic argument, which simply means if something begins, something must have caused. Right? If something begins, something must have caused, and at the end of the day, beginning, cause, the buck stops somewhere. That there's an uncaused causer, an unmoved mover at the beginning. That no matter what you say the beginning was, I can always say, and then? And before that? What was there? The unmoved mover. If the Big Bang is the truth, okay, what exploded? Right? Nothing did not explode into something. Something demands eternal. There's a guy named Lawrence Krauss. He's a brilliant scientist, and he would answer the question this way. He would say, no, you got it all wrong. Nothing is actually something. We can actually see that particles are popping in and out of existence all the time. So when you people say nothing, there's no such thing as nothing. There's always something. At the end of the day, he also is saying essentially the same thing that I am in different nomenclature. He's saying there's always something. Something is eternal. Or someone is eternal. I'd leave you with this. Would you stake your life on a multiverse? Would you stake eternity? You know, us folks that come here on Sundays and Thursdays, does that make us wackos if we come twice a week? Maybe. We think there's an eternity. We think that the clock just keeps going. Regardless of whether we're right or not, would you stake eternity on a multiverse? On the possibility that we're in the one of a zillion universes where it just happened to happen this way? Would you stake it on a guess? Would you stake everything, your life, your eternity, on Krauss's idea that nothing is something? I mean, if you were rappelling down a cliff, I would think you'd want the best grip you could get. Is that the best grip you can get? At the very least, it's really, really worth investigating. You owe it to yourself to investigate this with an open mind. And I'd say that to those of us, again, who have said we believe this stuff, and those of us who have not. You owe it to yourself to look into these things. Is there a God, and how would you know or not? Investigate it fully, investigate it with an open mind, and remember this: God is not afraid of your doubts. God is not afraid of your questions. And at the end of the day, really, neither are his people. So investigate it and come with us. Investigate it with us. Let me end with this. Many of us, and again, even some of us that say we believe in him, we get angry with God sometimes. We get angry with the things that we see, whether in this book or that people that claim to be Christians, that they do or say. Oh, got to be kidding me. If that's who God is, I don't want anything to do with him. Right? If you believe in God enough to be angry with him, would you believe in him enough to just investigate whether these things are true or not. Believe in him enough to look into him. God is not afraid of skeptics. He loves skeptics. And at the end of the day, he tells us this. Whether we come from a background of saying, you got to prove it to me, or I've got to experience it. He says that he's knowable. He says that he has made himself known in Jesus. So here's what I'd love for you to investigate. He says in Colossians 1, he, Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, and the firstborn of all creation. The image of the invisible God, meaning that who God is in his character, who God wants you to know, the same way I wanted the woman that I loved to know me, he has made himself known perfectly in Jesus. Would you believe in him enough to look into it? Let me pray for us.